Okay. So it popped up on a different screen that I wasn't expecting it to show up on, but that's good stuff. So Paul brought up a interesting question last week about how much battery do I really need for field day? And he was saying, don't bother me with all of the math. I can do that myself. Just tell me some real life facts in that. So that was very interesting, and I thought I would go through a little bit more of the detail on what's going on there. So kind of the topics I'm going to hit on is how much battery do you need for field day? Oh boy. Special considerations for different types of radios. There are some things you want to consider depending on the brand of radio you have. How much power can I get from a lead acid battery? Selecting the right lithium chemistry. And so how much power can I get from a lithium battery? So let's do a little bit of the math. So sorry about, and this will be really simple stuff, but it gives you some hard numbers that you can kind of work with to try and figure out how to size things. We'll consider the worst case scenarios in our discussion here. So this is kind of be the top end. So a modern radio uses between probably about 20 to, excuse me, 15 to 20, sometimes 25 watts when it's just setting in receive mode. If it's a lower end radio, like the good old ICOM 7300, it'll be more in the 15 watts here. If it's a higher end radio, then it's like a 7610 or something like that. It's probably in the 20, 25 watt area. So that you need to know because, part of the time, half the time you're going to be receiving, listening. And so you need to know how much power is being consumed there because that over a 24-hour period, that 15 to 20 watts there is not chump change. In transmit mode, single sideband will, with compression, generally uses about 40% of the output power. So if you have that thing setting at 50 watts, it's actually going to be using about 40 watts on output power. So that's one thing that you need to consider in the calculations. And so we're assuming that you have your compressor turned on and you're going to be uh, driving that thing as hard as you possibly can. In digital mode, generally you use about 50% of the output power. So digital modes, pretty much you have 100% modulation, but you only run that thing at 50% output. If you run it over 50%, you're probably going to be overheating the finals in it, and sooner or later, the rig will either cut back on power or let the smoke out of all the transistors that are in there. So how much power do I need? So when you do the math, it's something just doesn't add up. Everybody kind of thinks that, okay, if I need 100 watts out of this thing, all I need to do is give it 100 watts out. That's not really true. I did some interesting measurements to double check my numbers to see what I was really looking at. Okay, so to get 10 watts output of RF, it takes about 84 watts of input power going into your transceiver. So that means that you have to have a factor of about 8.4 times your um, output power to get the 10 watts out. Very interesting. Now, mind you, this is on a 100-watt rig. If you have something that's a QRP rig, that the finals and the whole thing is specially tuned to be able to produce a maximum of 10 to 15 watts, you're going to get a much lower multiplier. So in order to get 50 watts out of it, it takes 132 watts going into your transceiver to get that 50 watts. That's a multiplier of 2.6. To get 100 watts out of that, out of your rig, it takes 164 watts going into it, or basically it's a multiplier of 1.8 watts. If you start reading through literature, you'll find that generally most people just use a rule of thumb of around a 2 times multiplier for input power to what you get on output. So what the heck happens to all that extra energy? In the process of converting your DC battery voltage power into RF, there is a loss of energy. Anytime you convert one form of energy to another form of energy, there's always some type of loss. So that loss of energy is represented as heat in the transmit finals. So that's where you find your finals when you're running high power and you got a lot of power going through it. That losses generally shows up as just heat. So we now understand that 100 watts in doesn't yield you 100 watts out on power. We know what we have to adjust for input power. So let's go through some examples. Let's take single sideband. If you want to transmit 100 watts out, 40% modulation, so you have compression on. Let's say you have a 50% duty cycle between transmit and receive. So you're transmitting 50% of the time and receiving 50% of the time. And I selected that as just nice little, it makes the math work out nice and easy. So you work through that equation that I have just below there. And there you will see that I have an average power that I need about 48 watts of power to get on average to get 100 watts out. So over 24 hours, that means I'm going to consume, and I'm not saying that everybody's going to work 24 hours with 50% duty cycle of transmit and receive, but it makes it also easy to do the math as far as how many hours you expect to work out there. So, some guys are going to work 12 hours, some guys are going to work 18 hours, but it's very easy to scale the math to figure out what you need. So that means for 100 watts single sideband, you're going to need a battery that provides 1100 watts. So let's take a look at digital. Now we know digital, you're not going to be running your transceiver at 100 watts. You're going to be running at about 50% power, or otherwise you're going to be overheating your finals. But the kicker is that you're going to be running 100% modulation into that thing. So a 50% transmit receive cycle, you do the math, and it comes out with about 75 watts of power on average on what you're going to be needing. That works out for a 24-hour period, about 1,800 watts.
Mike, I think that's watt hours in your final answer.
Yeah, it should be watt hours. Yep. Sorry about that. Should be watt hours. Okay, so that gives you some numbers there. So let's take a look at some battery chemistries real quickly. Fully charged lead acid battery, that's going to give you on generally after it's settled down from charging about 12.7 volts out of it. So you can discharge that battery down to about 50%. Once you get below 50%, you're going to end up, and if you keep on running it down below 50%, you're going to shorten the life of that battery. You're not going to get a whole lot of life out of it. And also the voltage drop off is pretty quick on that. So a 100 amp hour lead acid battery yields around 600 watts when discharged down to 50%. The other thing that you have is that on some types of rigs that's set that 12.7 volts, especially when you get down into the 12 volt, lower into the 12 volt range, that's not enough to run most rigs these days. Most rigs really are built to accept 13.8 volts, something in that range. So it's very likely that you're going to need some kind of a battery booster to bump that voltage back up into the range that the rig is going to need there. So let's look at lithium batteries. There is all kinds of lithium batteries. Lithium ion, lithium cobalt, lithium iron phosphate. That's the one that we're going to focus in on. Lithium magnesium, lithium nickel. So, but the kicker is all these different kinds of chemistries all have different voltages per cells and different amount of storage and different charging parameters. So it gets really confusing to figure out what's the best fit for your radios. So here's a really quick chart that I pulled from another program. If you go down through the center column there and here's a bunch of the batteries listed on the left side there. You can see all of them, those cells have very different voltages and different characteristics on how the darn things work. So right now, we're going to be working with that lithium iron phosphate. So for ham radio purposes, and for the vast majority of what you see these days for lithium batteries that you will work well with our ham radio equipment, and that's the lithium iron phosphate. So if you look in the LIFE, LI stands for lithium, FE stands for iron, and the P stands for phosphate. So you normally have a 4-cell battery combination that fits very nicely for ham radio battery operation. So then, like I said before, this chemistry you find all over everywhere. This is what kind of the industry standard is that everybody's producing, and this is what you want to look for when you're trying to put batteries in service for your ham radio operation. So here's a quick little comparison between flooded lead acid battery in that center column and a lithium phosphate battery on the right side. You can see the starting voltage that you have for your lead acid is around 12.7 volts. Pretty low when you especially want something in that 13.8 area. For lithium phosphate, for lithium iron, you have 13.6 volts, much higher, much closer to that 13.8 volts. I'll put it this way, and you can work your way down. You can see what happens with your, and I screwed up on a number here. Whoops, dang it. That 50% should be 11.6 volts, not 12 volts. It should be 11.6 for the flooded lead acid battery. So that's the point that that thing drops dead, or you're really not supposed to use it anything past that. So when you get down to 11.6 volts, you are way out of the range of that 13.8 target voltage. I'll say that a lot of times when I'm mobile, I have a ICOM 7000, and it will not work at that voltage. It will not. I have to use a battery booster to get that thing to work. It works okay up in the upper levels, but really doesn't work at all when I get down close to 50% discharge. Now, if you look over at the lithium iron phosphate battery, here you can see it starts out at 13.6. When you get through 50% discharge, you're still in the 13s. And that ICOM 7000 still works just fine in that voltage area. And you can see that the drop dead place is really not until you get down to about 20 to 10% of the discharge. Normally you can take those things down to about 10% before the battery management system disconnects you. And you can see that even at 12.9 or 12 volts, I still got enough battery there to run the darn thing. Okay, so let's get different radios. So ICOM radios are especially sensitive to power. They expect and really pretty much demand voltage to operate radios at 13.8 volts. If you have voltage that drops down into the 12 volt area or drops below that 13 volts, you'll end up getting a radio that resets a lot of times when you hit transmit. The field effect transistors, the output transistors are directly connected to that 13.8 volts, the input power. So that means as that voltage goes down, your output goes down. It also means that that final system there is less effective. You will also get harmonic distortion when the voltage drops very low. So another thing that you have to watch out for in any rig is making sure that you use good size wires that go through. Everything I use always is at least 10 to 12 gauge wire coming from the battery to whatever rig that I'm running, so I don't have any voltage sag when I'm transmitting. And again, lead acid batteries generally require a battery booster because you just don't have enough consistent voltage to be able to properly run your radio. Now, Yaesu and other manufacturers out there are going to work a little bit differently, but I'll just say that it's always better to make sure that that rig has the right voltage when you're running on batteries. So let's wrap things up. Okay, to operate digital for 24 hours, you will need 1,800 watt hours of battery out there to operate that. So if you, so you can see what that is. To operate single sideband for 24 hours, you'll need about 1,100 watts. A 100 amp hour lead acid battery will provide about 600 watts. So that means you're not going to get a lead acid battery to take and work correctly for a full 24-hour full on. For a typically, like if you're running, like most guys, like 12 hours worth of hard work out there, that battery will get you through, just get you through. So lithium iron phosphate battery will provide 1,200 hours at a higher voltage. And again, that battery won't quite get you through on the digital side, but in real life, you're probably not going to be running 100% utilization on there. That lithium battery is going to get you through just fine on both single sideband and your digital modes. So everybody, I think, probably gets the idea there. So final slide here. The majority of ham transceivers expect the 13.8 volts. Low voltage will cause low output distortion and radio malfunctions. Your radio can do all kinds of weird stuff when that voltage starts getting pretty low. So when you are going to be running a lead acid battery, I really would recommend using some type of a battery booster to make sure that that rig has good solid 13.8 volts all the time. So that's it, guys. That's what, let me find where I'm at here. And any questions that you might have for, come on.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, that
Yep.
was I instigated that topic. And you know
What did you see as a general
Scott,
price difference between the lead acid and the lithium iron phosphate?
Okay, so that's been covered in other programs, but the generalization, I didn't go into quality of each of the batteries. Your lithium ion batteries, lithium iron phosphate batteries, you can get 1,000 to 2,000 charge cycles out of that. The price has been coming down really nice. So they were up around $1,200. You can easily get those things in the $600 range, and you can probably shop around and get something that is even a little bit lower. Where your lead acid battery, you're probably going to be paying between $120 to $200 for one of those. Those are good for around 300 to 500 charge cycles. So the length of time those things. So lead acid battery, that's going to last you around 3 years worth of life if you use a thing. A lithium battery, you're going to get 10 to 12 years worth of use out of that. So big difference in it. You pay more for the longer lifespan.
Nice. Thank you.
The thing I like, Mike, the thing I really like about the lithium batteries is the built-in battery management system.
Yep.
It basically prevents you from killing the battery. You can't run it down too low. You can't overcharge it. You can cook a lead acid battery really fast by overcharging it. You can kill them by undercharging them. The lithium ones have this intelligent circuit built in that protects the battery no matter what stupid things you do to it.
That's right.
Also, I think it's important to say if you're going to use a lead acid battery, it should be a deep cycle battery, not
Oh,
a
yeah.
regular
Yeah,
carb.
and that was my pricing, and that's
Yeah.
I didn't go through all the details on it, but the assumption is you're using a deep cycle battery that those guys are going to weigh about 80 pounds or
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
You don't want to use that.
Now, where
Hey,
that
Way to
where the
go.
lithium battery is going to weigh probably around 35, 40 pounds.
Yeah.
About 35 pounds.
For the same equivalent
Mhm.
charge.
Yep.
and they don't
So-
care if you tip them over, they won't spill acid all over the floor.
That's right. Also, there's been some lithium iron batteries that are coming on market that are 230 amp hours. They're basically the regular size battery about 1.5 times the size of it. But 1.5 size, you can have 230 amp hours.
Mm.
So there, if you wanted to play ham radio for all weekend long, you got a battery there that'll give you a lot of talking on the radio.
Yeah, I typically use two lithium iron phosphate 40 amp hour batteries. So I'll go through both of them during field day. But just like you said, Mike, I got the Icom. If I'm using the Icom 7300, I got to be real careful about that. So I keep an eye on the. I don't have it with me. I keep an eye on the voltage and the amp hours that I consume. Not the voltage, the amp hours, and then I'll switch them out. But those will last. The 240 amp hour guys will last no problem. And I do CW, which is very similar to I think digital, in terms of the the power consumed. About 50% duty cycle and all that junk. So yeah, it works. They work real well. I'm real happy with them.
So you also bring up a good point too, is that on batteries, it's kind of nice to have a voltage meter attached to the thing. And so you can see what's going on when you're transmitting. You can also watch that as your voltage continues to drop. So like if on a lead acid battery, when it's time to disconnect. You also know on a lithium iron phosphate battery, you can see how when you're starting to approach that 30 percentile of discharge. And you know that at some point in time, as you keep on going with it, that battery management system is going to come along and bite you and turn it off anyways, but at least it's coming up. So having some kind of an external voltage meter that gives you real-time display on that is kind of nice.
Yeah, and PowerWorks makes a nice little inline display.
Yep. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Okay, that's it. Back to you there, Paul.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Mike.
Mike. That was great. Can you hear me, or am I double
Yeah.
muted?
No, you're
Okay.
good.